Hi, so I'm Ling, I'm a developer.
Hi, I'm France, I'm a designer. By the way, how many designers do we have today? Not a lot, but as expected, as a mostly tech conference.
But how many developers work with designers? So, lots of us today. And well, we're very excited to be here today and spark the DevUx culture. So what's DevUx? It's basically, well, the idea of spreading the love between designers and developers, finally. So just a bit about myself. So I'm a lead developer at Theodore. It's a service company. And what I do is help my client build new products. So this whole story about DevUx started actually with a project. So a year ago, I was on this project, and I have to build a chat service in 6 months. So the project starts, and the designer sends me all the mockups. And actually, I get stuck at the first feature, because I have to display this chat bubble, but I don't have the icon. So I asked the designer for the icon. And he sends me this. And actually, I cannot work with this blue background. So I ask for the icon only. And then we're working on remote, so the designer is not there, and I have to wait for the icon, and I just cannot just go there and poke him and say, yeah, give me the icon, please, give me the icon. So I wait, and I get this nice PNG. But then I realize, hey, colors should be customizable, and actually I cannot do that with a PNG. I really would like an SVG format. So I ask for an SVG format, and I wait for the file to come. So finally, after all those back and forth about the stupid icon, and basically I wasted half a day on this, well, I finally get to finish my feature. So you must hear the frustration in my voice when I tell this story, but at that time I had much more things to worry about. I had 2 front ends, 2 back ends to manage, I had a team to train. So really, when it comes to mockup integrations, I didn't want it to come that way and be so painful. So then I took a step back, and then I remembered that, well, I had a friend, France, who was actually an experimented designer, and I wondered how she was working. So I reached out to her and asked for her help and her insights.
So when she called me, it was actually pretty funny because I was suffering on my own project. Back then, I was working at a sister company of Theodore, and so I was working with a client, and a very simple app. It was a mobile application with a very classic sign-up and login. So I gave the design for the sign-up form to the developers who start working on it, and then asked me for the login form. And I go, why do you need it? Because they're actually the same design with different wordings, but they insisted. So I ended up providing it to them. But I was very frustrated because if you look at both designs side by side, they're the same structure, they're basically the same thing, and it felt like they didn't try to understand the product as a whole and were just designing the pages as they came. And I was actually I had other things to do. I had a product owner who didn't want to do usability testing, so I was trying very hard to convince him that that was very important to do, and a very short timeline to design the rest of the features of the app. So having to copy-paste the same design and then changing the wording was the last thing I wanted to do.
So having heard each side of the story, we realized that by understanding each other more, we would actually enjoy working together. And that's how we started this whole DevUx thing. And so we've experimented on new projects, we've worked with other teams, and we were able to map out 4 levels of DevUx collaborations. So I'm going to work through them. Ground zero, obviously, is dysfunction. Then you can move up to level 1, the basics. Then level 2, efficiency, and finally the holy grail, symbiosis. So what we're going to do is walk you through different projects at different stages of collaboration to illustrate our points. And before that, just a summarize of the context. So the usual team composition of the projects would be the product team with designers and developers working hand in hand with the product owner that sets the product vision and the roadmap. Around this team, we have stakeholders such as the CEO, someone from marketing, someone from another product team, or even legal that's going to tell you, yeah, I need this or that.
So for the first story, by the way, all stories are true. For the first story, I'm gonna take a food tech app that my company worked on a couple of years back. I didn't work on the project. They were actually working with a freelance designer who had a very limited time on the project, but I did follow the project very closely. And so it started like this. The designer had time in advance to ship all of the design for the product. So he provides that to the team, and the product owner is very happy because that's exactly what she wanted. So the team happily starts. And actually, 1 week later, the CEO sees the app and he's very unhappy with the UI. He says that's totally not what he wanted for the app. And actually, that puts a stop to everything. The team has to start over on the design, and the development team has no choice but to only work on the backend for a while. And it took literally 3 weeks and 17 attempts to find a UI design that actually worked for both the PO and the CEO. And front-end development can start again, but that's when the designer had to leave because he only had that much time on the project. And that's, in theory, if all the designs are great. But of course, there were things that were missing, there were behaviors that were not clear, and so the developers, they had no one to turn to except the product owner, so they asked her for advice, and she goes, well, I'm not a designer, so I really don't know. So they do what they can, and then we call this best effort, which means they try to do something that's not too ugly and kind of works, and let's hope nothing breaks. And so yeah, so let's look back and see what went wrong. So first thing, the CEO made the whole team start over. And this happens when the process for product definition is not clear. So this happens mostly with mockups being late, too many people being involved in the decision process. There's other problems that can happen too. Like, for example, the vision of the product is not well defined. So it's very important at this very basic level to clarify what each team member has to do, what their responsibility is, and to define key moments where they can synchronize with each other. So very simple, very basic process would be the product owner is the one who is in charge of the product vision, so he writes down the specifications and the description, the task description. He has a dedicated moment with the designer so that he can pass on that vision so that the designer can make the mockups, and there's a separate moment for developers to altogether define the technical strategy to implement all this. So, of course, this is a very simple way of doing it, but don't be afraid of adapting this to your context. For example, if you know that your product owner wants or likes to have user inputs before he decides of the needs, bring him into your user research. If you know that developers can be very picky about certain things in the design, invite them to the UX workshop so that they can, together, you can find solutions for the upcoming features, etc., etc. And it might look a bit scary like this because it looks like they're all those big meetings, but they don't have to be big meetings. You can do this asynchronously over Slack or on any tool that you use. You can do that over a coffee break, 5 minutes. The important thing is just to update every member of the team, product, design, product owner, all together, on what is the new direction for the product. So what's the second issue? The second issue is that actually there were missing assets, and that happens a lot when designers do their job, ship the designs, and they just leave. And the thing that they don't realize is that mockups are not development-ready material. So what I really encourage people to do is to have a meeting, developers and designers together, to define what needs to be delivered alongside the mockups. And to centralize those, the assets and everything in a design handoff tool. So first you could just, for example, it could just be a simple checklist of everything that needs to be done. Maybe it's static content, maybe it's images, where can I find those images, etc. A very useful tool is to use a design handoff tool because they centralize everything. You can download the assets, but you also can see how the screen was built so that you see the margins, the font size, the font colors. You can even export some code. Depending on the product, yeah, my personal favorite is Zeppelin, but there's a lot of tools on the market, so we can talk about it later if you want. And the third thing is that because the designer had left, the developers were left on their own to figure out some behaviors and solutions. And this is again because the designer had to leave before the end of the project. What we really encourage you to do is to find a way to keep the designer working in parallel of the developers. For instance, I always manage to, during a certain sprint, help the developers with the current feature they're working on, because since I work on the feature beforehand, I can help them with certain issues, certain things that we hadn't seen up front. But I can also test the previous features so that I can learn from them and avoid some mistakes in the future, and I can start thinking about the upcoming features. And if the roadmaps of designers and developers are well synchronized, then it's completely possible to do this. So if I want to summarize, if you cut the design and development process in 3 phases: product definition, mock-up, delivery, and development. At the product definition phase, to go to the basic level of collaboration, you need to have a well-defined process. On the mock-up delivery, it's important to centralize everything so that developers know where to find the information and the assets. And on the development side, work together, work next to each other, so it's easier to communicate and not have moments where you just don't know what to do and have no one to answer to your questions. And if you do all this, then you got to level 1. So welcome, you've got the basics.
So what happens now with a level 1 project? So the team here is working on a travel agency tool, and what they're trying to do is display an itinerary on the map. This is the design that the designer suggests, and the team implements it. But actually, when it goes live, the itinerary do not look very user-friendly, and that happens on most itineraries. So the team has to roll back the feature. And the designer has to work again on a new design, this time with numbers for each place, numbers for each day, and the places that the traveler is going to visit. The thing is, the designer did not think of the case where itineraries loop, so developers get stuck when, for say, day 12 happened at the same place as day 5. And they need to figure out something to display that information. And in a fuss, the designer decides to use a tooltip to display that information. And then the developer finished the development, they implement the tooltip, and they decided to improvise on the hover and active state of that tooltip because they really were eager to finish that feature. And actually, I don't think the designer really liked it, but he went with it because they wanted to bring value to the users as fast as possible. So what are the new challenges that arose here? Well, first off, the designer did not use real data to build their mockup, so they were not really working on real use case, and they did miss edge cases. So to prevent that, it's essential that designers work with real data when it comes to having complex situations. And developers can provide those data, and they can also provide technical insights during the mockup creation. So for instance, this is a tool that France uses on Sketch, so it's called Craft. And what you can do is basically use an API to get some data and use those data to populate a list. So getting an image, getting a title, and it's really powerful when you need to populate, for say, a table or a list, because we all know there are many edge cases, and it's good to work with real data. The second thing that was missing was really a list of the states and edge cases on components. And sometimes what can also miss it was when it comes to responsive, you don't know how the screen behaves and the layout behaves. So really important to have a style guide that sums up all the states and behaviors of components, and also define the breakpoints for your responsive behavior. So we've mentioned, it was mentioned in the previous talks, to have like a common language between designers and developers, and that's why I really like the style guide. It's really a UI contract between the two, and so you know what colors should be used on the app, you know what font size, what font you should use, you know the convention around margins and spacings that should always be multiple of some values. You know like how the buttons should behave. You've got all the states. And you've got the form, different variations of forms, errors, states, etc. So I don't know if you have this on your project, but if you don't, really try to get this as soon as possible, because that will help you in your choices and to get an app consistent. And also, another thing that's helpful is user flow. What I like when I work on a complex feature is really to understand how you go from one screen to another. So here we have video uploading workflow. So first you start with the uploading page, then you move to a processing page, and finally, if it's successful, you get a preview, and if it's not, you go back to the initial upload page with an error message. This is an example of how the designer can show you how the layouts behave on smaller and wider screens. And really, the designer can provide all this, but it's essential that developers are onboarded on this and really understand how to use style guides or layout, etc. Otherwise, they'll just keep asking questions to the designer or just not follow the rules, and the app will not look like what the designer intended. So to summarize, for product definition, it's essential that the designer has real data and can work on the different edge cases. And for that, developers can provide technical insights. And for mockup creation and development, it's essential that designers and developers speak the same language, and you can define that contract with a style guide. And if you've done all that, then congratulations, you're reaching the level 2, you're being efficient already, you've got rid of most of the friction points, so it's quite an achievement when you're there, and things get, well, happier. So you could just stop there, but sometimes projects are more demanding and you need to level up your game.
So let's see how you can go from a level 2 project where everything runs pretty smoothly to and do better. This is actually a project that Ling and I worked together on, and we were working for a product owner who was very picky about the user experience, and he was right. He was a market leader. He couldn't afford to have bad user experience on his tool, and the tool was a technical tool. It was for developers. And in this tool, there was a very lengthy documentation, as you can imagine. And so I wanted that when you scroll down the documentation, you can see the anchor in the navigation on the left update, so that you always know where you're at, and you can easily come back to a point that you've missed previously. And of course, the product owner was completely on board with this idea, except that Ling tells me, well, I'm sorry, but it's too complex and we cannot fit it in the roadmap right now. So the product owner is pretty disappointed, but he understands and he goes along with it, and I try very hard not to cry. And as I said, the product owner was very picky, so he would always make us change tiny things here and there in the interface. If things were too small or not quite right, we'd fix it. Spacing was not right, we'd fix it. Alignment was not right, we'd fix it. Colors were not right, I'd find a new color and then we'd implement it. And as you can see, we were a team that was very, we would be pretty fast in answering, and we were very efficient working together. But there were still some friction points and we could do better. So how can we do better? The first thing you'll notice is that some cool features got shut down because of complexity. And this actually happened because I didn't involve Ling beforehand, before going to the product owner and giving my suggestions. What I should have done is sit down with her, say, okay, I want to do this. I think it would be a great addition to the product. What do you think? Can we do this? And this way we could have found a smart solution together instead of then going to the product owner, then going through her, then having to shut it down and making everyone very disappointed and wasting everyone's time. Actually, I want to give you an example on another product of where this happened, and it was very efficient. There was this pricing range, how it's called? Slider. So when the development started, they realized that when it's very together, you cannot read the prices at all. And so the developer came to me and said, okay, what do we do now? And I said, oh, but I actually wanted it to look like that. And he looked at me and he said, okay, so we have this pretty long form and you want me to spend however long on this. I mean, can't we find something that's a bit easier to do? And so it took 2 minutes, literally, on my desk, and we just said, okay, what's important? The important part is not to, at that point when the two ranges are very close, it's not to have both numbers visible. Users are probably going to slide, so if one of the numbers is legible, it should probably be enough, at least for the first for the MVP. And so we added a white background behind the first number so that it would always be legible. So in retrospect, this was probably not the best solution, design or UX wise, but the message here is that we spent 2 minutes together and we found a solution that we were both happy with. And that's what I really want to emphasize on. The second thing is that there were lots of back and forth in order to improve and polish the app. And those were, every time it wouldn't be much, but they would accumulate and become small delays. And so what we ended up doing at the end of the project was every week, Ling and I would just sit down and go through all over the app for 1 hour, and together we would find the little inconsistencies, the little things that need to be improved, and polish the app together. So we would basically pair program. And this worked well, but also something that works very well is if designers and developers share common design patterns. So by that, what I mean is basically speak the same language, but beyond speaking the same language, understand a bit the logic of each other's logic. For example, if I have a team that understands some basics of UX, if I tell them I want the designs to be keyboard aware, then they will know that whenever we talk about a form, the buttons need to be pushed up by the keyboard whenever someone is going to type. And I do not have to redesign every time the state where the buttons are below and then the buttons are pushed up, because we understand each other. Or on the other hand, if I have basis of understanding of HTML, I know that, well, if, for example, in this example, a table with 2 columns, I know that there's going to be a minimum space that I want to leave between the 2 columns. I can show it to the designer through the design handoff tool by putting the max width of the div actually, and so that the designer can inspect it, developer can inspect it, and doesn't need to come to me and say, okay, so when it's long, actually the text needs to wrap, but I don't know where. And so this way, it's much easier and much more efficient. So this would be or advice to go from level 2 to level 3. Make sure to involve developers in the mockup design process, and find smart solutions together whenever you find small problems. Make sure you understand and share the same design patterns, so that you do not always need to be asking questions. And have moments where you sit down together and improve the app together as a team, because that's your common goal, is to produce the best product for your users. And if you do that, then you're amazing, and welcome to level 3.
So now that you understand all about the different levels of DevUx collaboration, how can you actually spark this new culture within your teams? Well, first thing off, just define where you're standing now and where you want to go. If you have very siloed situation, if you just don't get along, just stick to the basics. If you have lots of delays, lots of back and forth, focus on efficiency. And finally, if you have high UX expectations, or if you just want to have fun, then aim for the symbiosis. So basically, this summarizes the different levels of DevUX collaboration that you can reach. But the most important message that we have for you is that DevUX is all about the mindset. So you need to think as a team and act like a team player. When is the last time that you had lunch or had a beer with the whole team, with your designers, and just chat? Because those team building moments are essential to build empathy and understand each other's problems and motivations. For instance, my message to the developers here in this room is really that designers cannot guess what you need to work properly, so don't hesitate to ask them. And, do not hesitate to call the designer whenever you have a design question, because they will save you time. They're used to solving those issues. Second thing to keep in mind is that details are here for a reason. So you can rely on something like a style guide or the design system to know the truth of what the app is going to look like. So whenever you have a doubt on colors, on font, on sizes, just refer to that. And pay attention, because the designer has taken the effort to provide you the information, so really use it. And finally, if you want to make your job more interesting, show that you care about the product, so that the product owner and the designer will involve you when they're making decisions.
On the other side, what the mindset I'd like to share with designers is, first of all, that mockups are not development-ready material. So you will need to provide extra steps for the developers to work, and so ask them what they need. Another thing that I've learned is that developers are amazing at finding errors and edge cases, and so it's so much easier when I involve them early on the design process, so they can tell me, well, this what is going to happen when this error happens, and I'm like, oh, are we going to have this error? And then, yes, believe me, this is my experience, of course we're going to have it. So it's so much easier when they're in the room with me to discuss those points. But beyond that, it's beyond the smaller component edge cases, we often get frustrated when we come up with a nice design and want it to be implemented and tell us, oh, well, no, sorry, it's too complex. But actually, what I've learned is also very frustrating for the developer to not be able to do it, because they do care about the product and they want it to be the best possible. So to avoid everyone's frustration, just involve the developer all the time during your process, because that's how you're going to come up with better features. In order to share the DevUX spirit around us, Ling and I have been doing this monthly DevUX drinks with people around us. The idea is just to chill and talk about what we're watching on Netflix, what we're excited about in the next tools that are coming out. For example, recently I shared a lot about Sketch 58, which I think is going to change a lot of things on the design side of the project. It's great because you can discuss in a very informal way about your problems, about how you feel as a person in a team that might be working well or might not. For instance, what I learned recently, what I learned during the first of these drinks is that actually, even though there's friction sometimes between developers and designers, developers are always so much happier when they work with designers, because in the end, at the end of the day, they're just proud of the product that they're making. And that meant so much to me.
Yeah, I really like those drinks too. I mean, wine and cheese, like what's more to ask for? But more seriously, there's something that I learned and that was surprising to me, and actually I felt very relieved to learn that, is that designers are happy to work with developers because they help them make them more thorough with their work. And that's a relief for me, because before that I only thought I was being annoying with all those requests and questions. So I think that's our message here. If you're interested in improving your collaboration, we've set up a website, devux.tech, with a manifest of well, DevUx collaboration. So you can go there, find the tools that we use, and if you want to like chat with us, we've set up a Slack also that you can join with this link. And yeah, I think that's it. Don't hesitate to come and see us afterwards at the booth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ling and Franz.